All right, let's talk about something that's hitting kitchens and businesses all across India right now, the LPG crisis. We're going to break down what's happening.
So I'm sure you've seen it, right? The long, snaking lines for cooking gas, the chatter about rising prices. It seems to have come out of nowhere. So what on earth is going on?
Well, to really get to the bottom of this, we have to look thousands of miles away. Because the root of this problem, the spark that lit this fire, didn't actually start in India.
Okay, so picture this. February 28th. A military conflict suddenly breaks out involving the US, Israel, and Iran. Now, this wasn't just some small regional issue. It was an event that sent massive shockwaves through the entire global energy supply chain. And this right here, this is the Strait of Hormuz. Think of it as a tiny bottleneck for a massive chunk of the world's energy. So much of the oil and gas that powers the globe has to pass through this one narrow waterway to get to places like India.
So how does this affect our cooking gas, our LPG? Well, get this. A staggering 85 to 90%. That's almost all of India's LPG imports has to squeeze through that one single strait. It shows just how much we rely on this one tiny, vulnerable spot. And with that route now basically blocked, our supply has been choked off right at the source. Okay, so that's the global picture, but let's bring it right back home, because this is where a story on the news becomes a real problem in your kitchen, for your family, and for local businesses. And of course, the first thing we all felt was the hit to our wallets. I mean, it happened almost overnight. On March 7th, boom, a 60 rupee hike on our home cylinders. And for businesses, a massive 115 rupee increase, just like that. And it's not just one city, it's everywhere. Just look at these prices. In places like Patna, a single cylinder is now over 1,000 rupees. That is a huge financial hit for so many families. But you know, it's about more than just the price tag. We're seeing real-world consequences. People are panic buying, lining up for hours. Restaurants are in crisis. Some are actually shutting down. I mean, even the famous Shah Gaus Cafe in Hyderabad is now using firewood to cook biryani. Think about that. Even the railways are feeling it, and hostels are having to completely change what they can serve. So, with everyone getting really anxious, the government had to jump in and start what's basically a firefight, rolling out emergency measures to try and get things under control. And the official word from the government is pretty clear. The Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas, Hardeep Singh Puri, has come out and said, quote, "There is no shortage for domestic consumers and no reason to panic." That's the message they want everyone to hear. Okay, so that's the message, but what's actually happening behind the scenes? Well, they're taking 3 big steps. First, they've told their own refineries to push production, ramping it up by as much as 25%. Second, they're using the Essential Commodities Act to make sure that households, hospitals, and schools get top priority. And third, to stop people from hoarding, they've stretched the waiting time between getting cylinders to 25 days. Right, so with all that happening, we're all left with some pretty pressing questions, aren't we? Like, what's going to happen next? What should we really expect in the coming weeks? Let's just cut to the chase. The biggest question, the one everyone is asking, is how much gas do we actually have left in the country right now? And the answer is, well, it's a bit tight. The estimate right now is that India has about 25 to 30 days of LPG stock. That's not a lot of wiggle room. It really shows how careful we need to be with the supply we have while the search for other import routes is on. So, the other big question, are prices going to go up again? The short answer is, it all depends on what happens in the Middle East. If that conflict gets worse and that strait stays closed, then yeah, more price hikes aren't just possible, they're pretty likely. And look, this isn't just speculation. The Ministry of Finance itself has put out a warning. They're saying this could mess with India's entire economy, from fuel costs to the value of the rupee, making inflation a much bigger problem. This is why it's such a big deal on a national level. You know, a crisis like this is tough, but it really shines a spotlight on a much bigger, long-term problem for India. So let's step back from the day-to-day panic and ask the big question. How do we stop this from happening again? At the end of the day, it really comes down to this. We import over 60% of our LPG. That's the core issue. It means anytime something goes wrong out there in the world, we feel it right here at home, immediately.
So this really puts us at a crossroads. We can stick with our current reality, dependent on imports, dealing with price swings, and facing these big financial and security risks. Or we can look towards a different future, one where we rely on ourselves, use sustainable energy, and build a more stable economy and environment. So, what would that shift to alternatives actually look like? Well, for rural areas, you've got biogas, which turns local waste into clean fuel. For those of us in cities, e-cooking is already proving to be cheaper to run than LPG. And for the country as a whole, it means less financial stress from crazy import prices and subsidies. Plus, it's a huge step toward our net zero goals. Which really brings us to the final thought here. Nobody wants a crisis. They're painful. But sometimes a crisis is exactly what you need to force a real, lasting change. So the big question we're left with is, could this difficult moment be the very wake-up call India needs to finally build a truly secure and independent energy future? That's something to think about.